Agroforestry, or should I say agroforestry or agroforestry? In a nutshell, why was the term introduced? How has it been defined? How has it been used over time? Well, to understand what agroforestry means, we may need to look at the world without, or a world view rather without. Yeah, and we've seen over time a strict segregation of agriculture and forestry, dividing the trees into so-called agricultural trees and forestry trees, ignoring that many trees exist in the agricultural landscape, misclassifying so-called multi-purpose trees that could be both agriculture and forestry. Foresters who see farming and farmers as a major threat, protecting a forest industry, emphasizing national relevance over local interest. Agriculture development, trying to replace tree-based inputs and services by fertilizer, pesticide, water management as part of agricultural intensification. Mechanization hindered by the presence of trees. Agricultural development, removing the trees unless they are windbreaks along roads or monocultural plantation blocks. And a culture, education and governance traditions that differ radically between agriculture and forestry. Against that background, we can see that agroforestry emerged as a formal term in the 1970s, 1980s, while we may claim that it is as old as agriculture or even older than agriculture as a separate activity. The first concept of agroforestry and the first definition focused at the plot level, the integration of trees with crops and livestock in purposeful, deliberate combinations, and was found to be still a common feature of tropical farming. Definitions were debated, typologies distinguished many different types of agroforestry based on the way space and time dimensions were managed by farmers. A farmer-driven diagnose and design effort focused the learning loops, emphasized markets, emphasized the relevance of trees for farms and livelihoods in multiple ways. Research focused on the tree-soil crop interactions, testing hypotheses about resource capture above and below ground, and went into bioeconomics, or the biological basis of plot level economics and the conditions under which integrated systems can be superior to segregated ones. Well, when agroforestry was about 20 years old, the emphasis shifted, or we added the concept of landscape, so a new definition of agroforestry focused on the landscape scale resource management, the relevance for the what we call the 1992 Rio Conventions on Biodiversity and Climate Change. And we shifted from specific technologies at the agriculture-forestry interface in the Venn diagram towards the whole interface of farms and forest. So trees on farm and farmers in the forest together defined agroforestry. The landscape meant looking at water flows and the way it can be managed, biodiversity, climate change mitigation, social ecological systems, even when that term was still quite new, local land governance, collective action, governance. Those terms were added to the interest of what agroforestry research would deal with and the scales at which it would interact with the agroforestry itself. Well, even that shift to a broader thing was not. And in the 2000s, we moved on, or we added to that a third concept of agroforestry, And that is not just the interface of agriculture and forestry, but actually the sum total of the two. Realizing that any attempt to define agroforestry as a separate policy domain would increase the problems of getting definitions right. It would have to separate agroforestry from agriculture. It would have to separate agroforestry from forest and forestry. And yet the main purpose was to combine the two. So we see the third paradigm as the sum total of agriculture and forestry, the level playing field between, as something that emerged in the 2000s, realizing that the policy level segregation was a major bottleneck of what happened in the landscape. It was helped by data that showed that with a very simple trees on farm definition, more than 40% of the agricultural lands of the world have more than 10% tree cover and could as such be seen as forest as well. So it showed that agroforestry is not just a niche interest, but a major part of the real world. But also realized that trees in agriculture bridge the relation between adaptation and mitigation in climate change, because they modify the microclimate, mesoclimate, and the social ecological systems approach gained further strength, linked with collective action, gender, rights-based approaches, stewardship, and the relevance of sustainable development goals, all in support of a policy perspective that brings agriculture and forestry together with agroforestry as an active interface between the two. So over time we've seen that against the background of non-agroforestry, segregation of agriculture and forestry, the first concept said that there are things happening at the interface. The second said that the interface consists of many different elements, both on the agriculture side and on the forestry side. And the third paradigm on the policy added to that we need to consider the whole agriculture forestry continuum in a policy frame, a land management, a livelihood management, a landscape management, in order to solve the problems that the world right now has. So in a nutshell, that is how agroforestry moved on from non-existent to plot level, to landscape level, and to policy level interest. Now, over time, we can see that the problem of a non-agroforest policy part was first contrasted with saying, yes, but actually that interface exists, agroforestry does exist, and it deserves names, it deserves recognition. And then in the next phase, the scientific basis became stronger and became more of a challenge, and the landscape part developed as much in the research domain as in the real world of landscapes, and challenging some of the legal basis of separating trees from forest and farmers from trees. And then at the moment, the third paradigm is again further based on linking knowledge with action, linking research in a policy frame, solving problems at the connected scales of policies, markets, and practices on farm, with trees as useful resources. So in a nutshell, that is the timeline of how agroforestry developed over time. Now, all of this is described in a book that is freely downloadable on the website address given here. So the book reflects on the first 40 years of agroforestry research, and it discusses the development of agroforestry concepts, more detailed from what I discussed here, research on trees, soils, farms, and interactions, example landscapes that shaped agroforestry into its second paradigm, and current policy concerns, mostly under the heading of the various Sustainable Development Goals, and the way agroforestry can contribute to a healthier, sustainable future through trees on farms. Happy reading!